A new tariff war is brewing, and this time, India is squarely in the crosshairs. The United States has announced sweeping new duties on Indian goods, taking tariffs up to a staggering 50%. This could spell a multi-billion-dollar hit to India's exports and shake up global trade dynamics.
And we're going to talk about trade. We're going to talk about many things, but it's really an honor to see you, and you have been my friend for a long time, and congratulations on having done a great job.
Thank you.
In a move that has rattled markets and policymakers alike, Washington has doubled down on India, raising tariffs from 25% to 50% on a wide range of imports. The White House says the decision is a response to India's ongoing purchase of Russian oil, despite US warnings. These new tariffs, among the highest imposed on any US trading partner, are set to kick in on August 27, giving a 21-day window before they hit full force. India might not be America's largest trading partner, but the hit could still be painful, especially for certain industries.
I think that this is the lowest point that U.S. India relations have experienced over the last 2 decades of strategic partnership. It's not the worst moment in the history of U.S. India relations, and that's because there were some really dark days for this relationship during the Cold War, particularly during the last few decades of the Cold War, and also when India formally became a nuclear weapon state in the late 1990s. That prompted U.S. sanctions that really plunged the relationship to a low.
India exports about $86.5 billion worth of goods to the US annually, but only around 20% of India's total goods exports head to the American shores. On paper, that's just 2% of GDP. So, should India be worried? The answer lies in the concentration of impact. Around $8 billion worth of exports, including gems and jewelry, textiles, apparel, chemicals, are directly in the firing line. These are labor-intensive sectors with deep supply chains and millions of jobs at stake.
The U.S. is one of the top export destinations for Indian goods, and it has held that status for quite some time. So just based on that baseline reality, there could be some notable deleterious impacts for India's economy. That said, India does have the fastest growing major economy in the world. It has one of the largest economies in the world overall, and it has been able to pursue effectively an export diversification policy, and it simply has been able to expand its trade partners in a big way. And after several decades of being relatively reluctant to expand its economic ties with the world, it's really been pursuing a number of trade deals, including free trade agreements with a number of key countries and players over the last few years.
Early estimates suggest these tariffs could cut US-bound exports by as much as 40 to 50%, effectively pricing Indian goods out of the American market. But the pain won't be felt evenly across India's economy. Pharmaceuticals, IT services, and semiconductors, some of India's biggest US-oriented industries, are currently exempt from these duties. That's a small relief. Indian IT firms in particular make up a large chunk of foreign earnings and are less reliant on physical goods trade. Also unaffected is Apple's manufacturing ecosystem in India, which revolves around electronic components that have dodged these duties. However, for sectors that do rely on exporting tangible goods, like textiles, which compete fiercely with Vietnam, China, and Bangladesh, the tariffs could be crippling. Not only do they raise costs, they also hand a competitive advantage to rival countries that are not facing similar penalties.
This will hit several export-oriented sectors of India, such as drugs and pharmaceuticals, electricals and electronics, gems and jewelry. But while there is a reason for us and India to be concerned, there is no reason for us to be alarmed. India continues to be a largely domestically driven economy, with exports accounting for about 18% of India's GDP. This measure will hit India's GDP by about 20 basis points, exports by about 50 to 60 basis points, and our employment scenario will also be dented to a certain extent.
So why is India being singled out and not, say, China or the EU? Despite China importing more Russian oil than India, over $62 billion worth, it has avoided similar US penalties. The reason is simple: leverage. China controls the global supply of critical minerals like gallium, rare earths, and graphite, all essential to America's defense, tech, and green energy sectors. Similarly, US allies like the EU also continue to trade with Russia, with $25 billion in oil imports last year, but haven't faced harsh tariffs. Even the US itself bought $3.3 billion in strategic materials from Russia in 2024. The inconsistency has raised eyebrows and accusations of selective punishment.
This is an opportunity for us to see, to make our internal manufacturing ecosystem more strong, and we have the opportunity to be the alternative for China plus one. I think that this is the time to really realign the supply chain and focus on economies other than the US for the timing. However, we urge both the government of India and government of US to engage in a dialogue so that these disruptions can be sorted out.
Symbolism or serious strategy? Some analysts argue that the 21-day delay in enforcement gives both sides room to negotiate. But even if the move is symbolic, the market reaction is real. The Indian rupee has wobbled and foreign portfolio investors have grown cautious. Not over direct trade losses, but due to the broader uncertainty this kind of policy generates.
And I think that the main reason why the talks went downhill so suddenly was a miscalculation on both sides. I think that India really thought that the US side would be willing to accept India's red lines, which included not easing protections in sensitive sectors like agriculture, which has politically important constituency in terms of farmers. Whereas on the US side, I think there was a miscalculation, believing that India would be willing to make every concession that the US was looking for it to make, and the US was looking for India to make many concessions. But at the end of the day, they are close to the finish line. You could argue that you have the worst possible outcome coming out of these talks, and that India has been slapped with some of the highest tariffs that any country has been slapped with. But if they agree to come back and they're able to find some workarounds, then there might be an ability to reach a deal.
Meanwhile, the Indian government is expected to consider targeted support for sectors hit hardest, possibly through export subsidies, tax relief, or market diversification strategies. With elections nearing in both countries, this tariff clash may be driven as much by politics as by economics.
Domestic politics in India will loom very large, given how unhappy the Indian public is about how President Trump has treated India, and given how many concessions India has made to the Trump administration, which don't only entail trade concessions, but also broader concessions on issues like immigration. The Indian government took back dozens of undocumented Indian workers. They were flown back to the US with some of them in shackles. This is a very politically risky thing for the Indian government to do. So I think that if talks begin, India's government will need to be careful, and it will not be willing to make many more concessions, which means that the onus might fall on the US side to be willing to relent from its very maximalist position that it's taken in the negotiations.
One thing is clear. The world's fourth largest economy now faces a real export squeeze, and the road ahead could get even more turbulent. With Farhan Khan, Bureau Report, India Today Global.